At my sister's engagement party, she raised her glass and said, "Some of us find love, some of us just fund it." Everyone laughed. I didn't. I just smiled, walked up to the gift table, and took the envelope with the honeymoon tickets I bought for $9,000. Then I texted the travel agent. 5 minutes later, she checked her phone and started screaming. At my sister's engagement party, Brooke lifted her champagne glass, smiled directly at me, and said, "Some of us find love. Some of us just fund it." The room exploded with laughter. Dean laughed beside her like she had delivered the funniest line of the night. Mom practically glowed with amusement. Dad gave a weak smile that disappeared almost immediately. I didn't laugh. I smiled instead, because sometimes smiling is the only thing stopping you from doing something you'll regret. Then I crossed the room, walked to the gift table, picked up the gold envelope containing the $9,000 honeymoon I had bought for Brooke and Dean, slipped it into my purse, and texted my travel agent 3 words: "Cancel the trip." 5 minutes later, Brooke checked her phone and started screaming my name. What nobody in that restaurant knew was how much that envelope had cost me. For 3 months, I had taken every extra hour I could get. I taught physical education during the day, tutored kids after school, and drove Lyft on weekends until my eyes burned from staring at taillights. I had saved enough to book Brooke and Dean 10 days in Hawaii round-trip flights, an oceanfront resort, a private snorkeling excursion, and dinner reservations for every night. I hadn't told anyone because I wanted to see Brooke's face when she opened it. That was the stupid part. Even after everything between us, some part of me still wanted to make my little sister happy. Instead, she turned me into the punchline of her engagement toast. Some of us find love. Some of us just fund it. She had no idea how painfully accurate she was about the second half. The refund request didn't feel like revenge. My hands were trembling while I sent it. It felt like correcting a mistake. Brooke's expression changed the instant the notification appeared on her phone. Her champagne smile vanished. Her eyes found mine across the restaurant, and suddenly she wasn't entertaining a room anymore. "Natalie!" she shouted. Dean leaned toward her, demanding to know what happened. I didn't answer either of them. I walked straight outside. The cold night air hit my face, and for the first time all evening I could breathe. I had nearly reached my car when Brooke came clicking after me in heels. "Natalie, come on. It was a joke. Don't be so sensitive." Dean followed, adding something about me needing to lighten up. Neither asked why I had taken the envelope. They still didn't understand exactly what they had lost. I got into my car and drove away. My phone buzzed until nearly 2 a.m. Brooke, Dean, Mom, cousins, an aunt I spoke to maybe twice a year. Apparently humiliating me in front of 50 people was comedy, but quietly leaving made me the villain. Dad was the only person who didn't call. I understood why. He had been the only one who hadn't really laughed. Sitting alone in my dark apartment with a drink in my hand, I realized the canceled honeymoon wasn't going to be the end of this. It was the first time in years that I had refused to absorb the damage and pretend everything was fine, and my family had no idea how to handle a version of me that wasn't willing to fold. The following morning, I woke with 36 unread messages and 5 missed calls. By noon, my front door unlocked. Mom was the only person besides me who still had a key. She marched inside and immediately started pacing. "You embarrassed your sister. You walked out like a child. Everyone was asking what happened." I waited for her to ask what Brooke had said to me or why I had left. She never did. Instead, she complained about appearances until she finally said, "If that gift was something expensive, you could have at least told her before making a scene." That was when I realized Brooke hadn't told her. $9,000, I said. Mom stopped walking. "I paid for their honeymoon. Flights, hotel, excursions, dinners, everything. And after her toast, I canceled it." For half a second, the truth broke through her expression. Then she recovered. "That isn't the point, Natalie." Of course it wasn't. It was never the point when the facts favored me. She said Brooke had been embarrassed. I asked whether Brooke regretted embarrassing me. Mom ignored the question, so I told her I wasn't attending the wedding. She warned me that I would regret tearing the family apart over a joke. That night, Dad finally called. He didn't lecture me or tell me to apologize. He simply said, "I get it, Natalie." Somehow those 4 words meant more than every message I had received all day. Brooke left a crying voicemail later. She said she hadn't known the honeymoon was that expensive. She had only been trying to make everyone laugh. Dean supposedly felt terrible too. But what bothered me wasn't the crying. It was the softness she put into my name. The exact voice she used when we were children after she broke something and wanted me blamed for it. 2 days later, Mom texted me, "Your father says you're being dramatic. Stop punishing your sister over one joke." The problem was that Dad and I had spoken that morning, and he had told me the exact opposite. I called him. "Did you tell Mom I'm being dramatic?" He sounded exhausted. "Of course not. Your mother wants everything back to normal." Normal? In our family, normal meant Brooke got what she wanted. Mom rewrote whatever story made that possible. Dad stayed quiet, and I swallowed the consequences. A day later, Brooke and Dean were waiting beside my car when I left work. Brooke tried smiling as if enough time had passed to erase what happened. "Natalie, can we please talk?" Dean said they hadn't known what I had done for them. They had been excited about Hawaii. The trip apparently meant more than I realized. "This isn't about Hawaii," I told him. "Then what is it about?" he asked. "Respect." The silence afterward told me everything. They understood money perfectly. Respect was the foreign concept. I drove away while they stood in the parking lot. That evening, Dad warned me Mom was still pressuring him to talk sense into me. I told him not to bother. Somewhere during that conversation, another thought returned to me: the silver Toyota Highlander Brooke and Dean drove every day. Brooke had needed the Highlander 16 months earlier while changing jobs. Her credit wasn't good enough for financing, so Mom convinced me to help. I had signed the loan, continued paying the insurance, and technically retained responsibility for the vehicle. Brooke treated it as hers, but every accident, missed payment, and liability could land on me. After the engagement disaster, I logged into the financing account and confirmed everything was still tied to my name. I called Brooke once and listened long enough to establish that she and Dean were still driving it daily. Then, several mornings later, I reported the vehicle as being used without my authorization and contacted the insurer to freeze coverage. That evening, Brooke called screaming. She and Dean had been headed to a bridal fitting when they were stopped during a routine traffic check. The registration problem surfaced, and the Highlander ended up at an impound lot. Brooke demanded that I fix everything immediately. "No," I said. After the toast, the messages, Mom's lies, and days of being told that my reaction mattered more than what had caused it, I was finished pretending I owed them unlimited access to whatever belonged to me. Mom called the following day accusing me of sabotaging Brooke's life. I asked whether she wanted to take over the loan herself. She suddenly had nothing to say. Dad was more cautious. "Are you sure you want to go this far?" he asked. "Yes." I told him it wasn't revenge anymore. It was closure. After a long silence, he answered, "Then do what you have to do." I thought that would finally end it. Then Brooke appeared at my door alone. No polished dress, no perfect makeup, no Dean standing behind her. She wore an oversized hoodie, her eyes were dark from lack of sleep, and something about her looked genuinely frightened. She told me they were in trouble. Dean had made risky financial decisions. A real estate deal had gone wrong. They needed help one final time, just enough money to keep everything from collapsing. I should have closed the door. I should have remembered every childhood lie, every unpaid loan, every time she had turned my loyalty into leverage. Instead, I stepped aside. "Come in," I said. I didn't know it yet, but those 2 words would cost me far more than the honeymoon ever had. Brooke stepped into my apartment and sat on the edge of the couch, like she was afraid getting comfortable would make me change my mind. For a few seconds, she just stared at her hands. Then the story came out. Dean had gotten involved in a real estate deal through a friend of a friend. One of those supposedly easy property flips where you buy something cheap, renovate fast, and sell before anyone has time to ask questions. Except halfway through the renovation, the city shut the entire project down over code violations. The contractor disappeared. Dean's friend stopped returning calls. The private lender who financed part of the purchase suddenly wanted his money back, and apparently he wasn't the kind of man who sent polite reminders. "How bad is it?" I asked. Brooke swallowed. 60. For a second I thought she meant 60,000. Then I saw her face. 60,000? She nodded. They had emptied their savings, maxed their credit cards, and borrowed from anyone who would still answer their calls. Then she finally told me why she was really there. "I need 55,000, Natalie. Just as a loan." I actually laughed once, but there was nothing funny about it. $55,000 was almost everything I had managed to build for myself. My emergency fund, my savings, the cushion I had created after years of realizing that when something went wrong in my life, nobody was coming to rescue me. Brooke rushed to fill the silence. 6 months, she promised. Maybe less. They had another investor interested. Dean was already working on recovering part of the money. This was only to keep the situation from escalating before they could stabilize everything. She kept using words like temporary, bridge, emergency, family. Every word sounded carefully selected. I stared at her and thought about the Highlander sitting in an impound lot because I had finally decided to stop financing her choices. Now, days later, she was sitting in my living room asking me to finance an even bigger one. She hugged me before leaving. It was quick and strangely mechanical, as if she knew I hadn't agreed, but wanted to leave behind something that felt like reconciliation. I stood by the door long after she disappeared down the hallway. That night, I barely slept. Memories kept surfacing like things I had tried to drown years ago. Brooke crashing my car when we were younger and letting Mom believe I had caused the damage. Brooke dropping out of college for a year, then somehow convincing our mother that I had encouraged her to do it. Brooke borrowing a few $100s until Friday and disappearing whenever Friday arrived. There had always been an excuse, and there had always been me. Still, something inside me kept whispering that this situation was different. Maybe she was genuinely scared. Maybe almost losing everything had changed her. Maybe this was the moment when my sister finally understood what I had done for her all those years. Looking back, I think that hope was the most expensive thing I ever owned. 2 days later, I went to the bank. I didn't simply drain my savings, because even that wasn't enough. I took out a home equity line of credit against my condo, the only property I owned outright enough to borrow against. I sat across from a banker signing document after document while a voice in my head screamed at me to stop. I ignored it. I kept telling myself this was temporary. 6 months. Brooke would repay me. Dean would fix the investment. We were family. I transferred $55,000 into the account Brooke gave me that afternoon. There was no attorney, no promissory note, no repayment schedule, nothing legally protecting me beyond a few text messages. Brooke replied almost immediately, "Thank you. You seriously saved us. I love you." Then she sent a voice message saying the same thing, only warmer. "You have no idea what this means, Natalie. You saved us." I listened to that message 3 times. I wish I had known it would be the last time I heard her voice as a free woman. The first week passed without an answer. I texted Brooke asking whether everything had been resolved. Nothing. I told myself she and Dean were dealing with lawyers or investors. Week 2, I called Dean. Straight to voicemail. I tried Brooke again. Her phone rang, then stopped accepting calls altogether. By week 3, something cold had settled in my stomach. Mom told me Brooke and Dean had gone off the grid for a bit because they needed space after everything they had been through. She said they had taken a small trip to clear their heads. "Where?" I asked. Mom hesitated. "I don't know." That answer finally broke whatever denial I had left. I drove to Brooke's place that evening. The apartment looked abandoned, curtains closed, mail pushed against the door from inside. No car, no lights, no movement. I knocked until my knuckles hurt anyway. By week 4, I was sitting inside a police station, explaining to an officer why I had voluntarily transferred $55,000 to my sister and now believed she had stolen it. Saying it aloud made me feel stupid in a way nothing else ever had. Fraud. Theft. Deception. The officer took my statement, copied the messages, wrote down Brooke and Dean's information, and gave me a case number. His expression told me he had heard versions of this story before. That night, Mom left me a voicemail. "How could you report your own sister? Do you understand what this could do to her? What this could do to our family?" She wasn't terrified that Brooke had disappeared. She was furious that I had made the disappearance official. The illusion was gone now. There would be police reports, bank records, questions. There would be a version of events Mom couldn't rewrite at the dinner table. The next day, Mom called again, this time crying. She claimed she hadn't known what Brooke and Dean were planning. She thought they truly needed time away. She said she never imagined they would take my money and run. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Dad called later and said something simpler. "I'm sorry, Natalie." He believed me. He told me reporting them was the right thing to do, even if the rest of the family hated me for it. But doing the right thing didn't change what happened when I opened my banking app. $55,000 was gone, and the debt attached to my condo was very real. I started wondering whether I would have to sell the place. The thought made me physically sick. Brooke hadn't just taken money. She had taken the one place in my life that had always felt safe and turned it into collateral for her escape. 3 months passed. Every morning I checked the investigation status online. Every morning it still said open. My life became smaller because shrinking it was the only way I could afford the payments. I canceled cable, canceled the gym, stopped eating out entirely. I sold a watch an ex-boyfriend had given me for my 30th birthday, and pawned several things I never imagined I would have to sell. Some nights dinner was canned soup eaten over the kitchen sink, because sitting at the table reminded me too much of the bills stacked there. Unknown numbers made my heart jump. Half of me feared Brooke was calling. The other half desperately wanted her to. I kept imagining explanations. Maybe Dean had manipulated her. Maybe they were trapped somewhere. Maybe something terrible had happened. Anything was easier to accept than the simplest possibility that my sister had looked me in the eyes, told me she loved me, taken $55,000, and disappeared, because that had been the plan all along. Then, one Thursday afternoon, while I was setting up cones for soccer practice, my phone rang. The detective handling the case asked if I could talk privately. Something in his voice made me leave the field immediately. "We found them," he said. Brooke and Dean had been located in Flagstaff, Arizona, living in a rented cabin far enough outside town to avoid curious neighbors, but not far enough to disappear completely. Dean had been working for cash under a false name detailing RVs. Brooke was doing freelance graphic design work online using another person's payment account. Investigators had traced transactions through a third party who had been helping them move money. They had been arrested without incident. For several seconds I couldn't speak. I had imagined that phone call for months, but when it finally came, I felt no triumph, just exhaustion. That evening I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring at neatly arranged bills, mortgage, utilities, insurance, HELOC. Every one of them carrying my name, while the people who created the disaster had been hiding hundreds of miles away under false identities. A few days later, a correctional facility number appeared on my phone. I nearly ignored it. Then I answered. Brooke's voice cracked the instant she said, "Natalie." She began crying so hard that some of her words blurred together. She said Dean had convinced her they only needed to disappear temporarily. She insisted they always planned to return. She said everything spiraled and she had gotten scared. Then she begged me not to press charges. The district attorney was discussing prison. Dean was blaming her. She didn't know what to do. "I need my sister," she whispered. The sentence hit me strangely. She needed her sister now, after 3 months in which apparently I had needed no one. I didn't yell. I didn't tell her I hated her. I didn't ask where the missing money had gone. I simply listened until she stopped talking and waited for my response. Then I hung up. That same day, I spoke with the district attorney. The evidence was far worse than I had realized. Bank transfers, false identities, third-party accounts, messages documenting their movements and attempts to hide funds. The prosecutor listed possible charges: wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and serious theft offenses, and explained that restitution could become part of the case. Then came the question everyone in my family would eventually hate me for answering. Was I willing to move forward? Was I willing to testify if necessary? Did I want restitution pursued? Yes, I said. To all of it. Mom called within hours of learning what I had decided. She was sobbing before I finished saying hello. She accused me of tearing our family apart and said Brooke didn't deserve prison. According to her, Brooke had trusted the wrong man and panicked. Deep down, Mom insisted, she never meant to hurt me. She didn't just hurt me, I said. She tried to ruin me. Mom begged me to handle it privately. I asked whether she knew I might have had to sell my condo because of what Brooke had done. Silence. I asked whether she understood what $55,000 represented to me. More silence. Then came another excuse about fear and Dean's influence. That was when I finally understood there would never be a version of this story in which Mom held Brooke completely responsible. Dad called later. He didn't try changing my mind. When I told him I was cooperating fully and that I didn't care how angry everyone became, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good, let it burn." The trial was scheduled for late fall. I took time away from work when necessary, started organizing records with an attorney, and saved every message Brooke had ever sent about the money. One night I replayed her final voice note from before she disappeared. "You saved us." Her voice sounded almost cheerful. She had been right. I had saved them once. I had taken money secured against my own home and handed them a doorway out of the disaster they created. But I finally understood something I should have learned years earlier. Saving someone from consequences doesn't always save them. Sometimes it only gives them enough room to hurt you again. The next time I saw Brooke would be inside a courtroom, and this time there would be nowhere left for either of us to run. By late fall, the case no longer felt like something happening to my family. It felt like paperwork. Statements, bank records, screenshots, attorney meetings, calls from the district attorney, and folders filled with evidence proving that my own sister had deliberately taken money secured against my home and disappeared with it. There was something almost comforting about that coldness. Facts didn't care that Brooke and I used to build blanket forts together. Bank transfers didn't care that Mom still referred to her as a frightened girl who made a mistake. Investigators didn't care that Dean supposedly influenced her. The evidence showed choices. Brooke had asked me for the money. Brooke had provided the account. Brooke had thanked me after the transfer. Brooke had helped move funds, disappeared to Arizona, used another person's payment account, and lived under circumstances specifically designed to make her harder to find. By the time court approached, I wasn't asking myself anymore whether I was betraying my sister by cooperating. I was finally asking why everyone had spent so many years expecting me to betray myself for her. There was no dramatic trial in the end. No last-minute witness bursting through the courtroom doors, no screaming confession, no emotional speech from Brooke begging the judge for mercy. The evidence was too strong, and both Brooke and Dean knew it. Their attorneys negotiated plea agreements rather than risk a full public trial and harsher sentences. I sat behind the prosecutor while their charges were read, and watched two people who had once behaved as though consequences belonged to everyone else quietly admit guilt. Wire transfers, false identities, third-party accounts, fraudulent activity, conspiracy. The language sounded clinical, almost detached from the months of fear behind it. Brooke stood beside her attorney, looking smaller than I remembered. Dean looked irritated. like the courtroom itself was inconveniencing him. Neither of them resembled the polished couple from the engagement party anymore. The judge sentenced them both to 18 months in state prison. That number hung in the courtroom for a moment. 18 months. Brooke stared at the floor. She never looked at me, not once. Dean did. When the judge finished speaking and officers moved toward them, he turned his head just enough to find me sitting there. There was still something smug in his expression, some leftover disbelief that the charm and excuses hadn't worked this time. Then the handcuffs closed around his wrists. His face changed. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I didn't give him anything. I just held his gaze until he looked away. That seemed to bother him more than anger would have. The court also ordered restitution, and that was where I learned something unexpected. Investigators had frozen one of the accounts before Brooke and Dean managed to empty it completely. Between seized funds and assets tied to the scheme, I was going to recover roughly 90% of the $55,000. The remaining 10% was gone, spent during their 3 months in hiding on gas, food, temporary lodging, cash withdrawals, and whatever else they needed to maintain their illusion of escape. A few weeks after sentencing, I received the restitution payment through the state. There was no apology attached, no handwritten note from Brooke, just an official document, numbers, signatures, and money returning to an account it should never have left. I stared at the deposit for a long time. Financially, it saved me. Emotionally, it changed almost nothing. I could pay down most of the HELOC. I didn't have to sell my condo. I could breathe again when bills arrived, instead of calculating which possession I might sell next. But nobody could reimburse the months I had spent waking up, terrified that I was going to lose my home. Nobody could return the part of me that had once assumed a family member asking for help probably needed help. Trust wasn't sitting in a frozen bank account waiting for a judge to release it. Neither was sleep. Neither was dignity. That 10% of missing money almost felt symbolic. You can recover most of what someone steals from you and still understand that something important is permanently gone. Mom was waiting outside the courtroom after sentencing, crying so hard that several relatives kept looking over. She grabbed my arm and said, "This is going to destroy Brooke's life. Not Time's. Are you okay? Not Time's. I'm sorry she did this to you. Brooke's life." Always Brooke's life. Mom told me I should have tried harder to forgive. That families should handle problems without police and lawyers. That 18 months could follow Brooke forever. I looked at her and asked the question I had been carrying for months. What would you have done if I stole $55,000 from Brooke and disappeared for 3 months? Mom opened her mouth, then closed it. What if Brooke had put her home at risk to save me, and I took the money and ran? Still nothing. Her silence finally gave me an answer more honest than anything she had said since the engagement party. Dad hadn't come to the sentencing. Crowded courtrooms and family spectacle had never been his style, and by then he had stopped pretending he could mediate between Mom and me. I called him afterward from my car. 18 months, I said. Both of them. There was a pause. Then Dad said, "Good. About time." That was all. No celebration. No lecture about family unity. No fake sadness. I realized Dad had probably understood Brooke long before I did. Maybe his biggest failure had been staying quiet while Mom protected her. Maybe his silence had helped create the person Brooke became. But at least when everything finally collapsed, he didn't ask me to rebuild the same structure that had crushed me. The fallout was surprisingly fast. Brooke and Dean became names. People stopped wanting attached to them. Friends disappeared. Relatives who had laughed at Brooke's engagement party toast suddenly remembered stories about unpaid debts, manipulative favors, and suspicious promises. Wedding invitations stopped including them. Holiday plans were made without mentioning prison visitation schedules. Social media photos disappeared. Everyone acted shocked that things had gone this far, even though many of them had spent years watching smaller versions of the same behavior. That part irritated me. Once Brooke was convicted, people began telling me they had always known something was off. I wanted to ask where all that wisdom had been while they were laughing at me. Something else changed, too. People started treating me differently, not dramatically. Nobody made speeches about it, but I noticed. Relatives who used to dismiss my opinion started calling when they had financial questions. Cousins asked what I thought before co-signing loans. An uncle who barely spoke to me at gatherings asked how I had managed to stay calm through the investigation. At Thanksgiving, someone handed me the carving knife without asking Dad first. Conversation shifted when I entered the room. I had spent years being Natalie, the single gym teacher who drove an ordinary car, worked too much, and apparently existed to rescue anyone whose plans exceeded their bank account. Now I was Natalie, the woman who had finally said no and meant it. Thanksgiving itself was stranger than I expected. Brooke's chair wasn't literally reserved, but everyone seemed aware of the space where she normally would have been. Mom was quieter than usual. Dad drank his wine and avoided sentimental speeches. Nobody brought up the engagement party. Nobody mentioned Hawaii. Dean's name never came up. For the first time, silence didn't feel like people protecting Brooke. It felt like they were learning to exist without arranging the entire room around her. I caught Mom looking at me once from across the table, and for a second I wondered if she finally understood. Then she looked away. Maybe understanding would take longer. Maybe it would never come. Brooke began sending letters from prison a few months later. She sent them through Mom because I had made it clear I didn't want direct contact. They were usually short. Updates about prison routines, comments about books she was reading, complaints about Dean, who apparently blamed her for almost everything. Occasionally she wrote something like, "I hope someday we can talk," or, "I think about how things used to be." There were expressions of regret, but never the apology I would have recognized as real. She never wrote, "I knew what I was doing when I took your money." Never wrote, "I chose to disappear." Never wrote, "I put your home at risk and expected you to carry the consequences." Her letters always seemed to orbit responsibility without landing on it. Mom saved everyone as though they were evidence that the old Brooke still existed somewhere underneath everything. She talked about Brooke's release date with cautious excitement. She imagined dinners, reconciliation, eventually maybe another wedding if Brooke and Dean separated after prison. I stopped arguing with her. She was allowed to hope. I was allowed not to participate. Forgiveness, if I ever reached it, would not mean handing Brooke another key, another car, another check, or another chance to prove that my boundaries were negotiable. That version of sisterhood was dead. Months after the sentencing, I listened one final time to the voice message Brooke had sent immediately after I transferred the money. Her voice was bright and relieved. "You seriously saved us. You have no idea. I love you." I remembered how proud those words had made me feel that afternoon. Now they sounded different. I deleted the recording. Then I paid another chunk toward the remaining HELOC balance, closed my banking app, and went for a walk without my phone. The evening was cool, and for once, there was nobody calling to demand something from me. Brooke and Dean chose the investment. They chose the lies. They chose my money. They chose to run. And when every excuse finally disappeared, I chose myself. I used to believe family meant keeping the bridge standing, no matter how many times someone drove a truck through it. I don't believe that anymore. Sometimes a bridge becomes dangerous because you are the only person repairing it while everyone else keeps setting fires on the other side. Eventually, protecting yourself means stepping away and letting it collapse. So I did. I watched that bridge burn until there was nothing left connecting me to the person I had spent my whole life rescuing. Then I turned around, and for the first time, I didn't look back.